Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm Paul TX141 Walsh, welcoming you to an all new Ace in a Day gameplay for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode we shall be reviewing the highly requested A-36 Apache, an American attacker coming at a battle rating of 2.7 and a tier of 2. Having already provided a historical overview as to the predecessor to this aircraft, i.e. the Allison-engined P-51 Mustang, today's historical overview will focus purely on the history of the A-36, and if you are interested in the history of the Allison-engined P-51, please see the link in the top right corner of your screen as displayed now. Otherwise, let us proceed. Even before the successful combat initiation of North American Aviation's P-51, or Mustang Mark I as it was known in the RAF service, during the Dieppe Parade on the 19th of August 1942, Howard Kindleberger, the President of North American Aviation, requested a production contract for the P-51 from the United States Army Air Force, the USAAF. The request was declined by the USAAF as there was no funding available for the rest of the year. However, they did want to keep the P-51 in production. To overcome this issue, the USAAF identified that funds were available for an attacker aircraft, i.e. dive bomber or a ground attack plane. As a result, modifications were specified by General Oliver P. Eccles to turn the P-51 into a dive bomber. A contract of 500 of these dive bombers, designated A-36A, was signed on the 16th of April 1942. And to put this in perspective, this was before the first production flight of the P-51 had occurred in May of 1942. The aircraft's design was essentially the same as the Allison-engined P-51, with some role-specific modifications. The wing structure was redesigned and reinforced, so up to 1,000 pounds of external bomb ordnance could be carried onto the wings as two 500-pound bombs, and 4 cast aluminium dive brakes were added to the wings. The plane was powered by the Allison V1710-87 1,325 horsepower liquid-cooled V12 engine, an engine that was ideal for low-altitude operations, i.e. below 12,000 feet or 3,658 metres altitude. The plane was armed with 6 12.7mm M2 Browning machine guns, 2 mounted in the nose and 4 in the wings. The first A-36A was produced in September of 1942 and underwent its first flight in the following month. The test flight program proved successful and led to the A-36A Apache entering combat service with the United States' 27th Fighter Bomber Group, or 27th FBG, in French Morocco as part of the North Africa campaign in April of 1943. The A-36A enjoyed consistent results with the 27th FBG, who, after being deployed to the Mediterranean theatre in May of 1943, requested that the plane adopted the name Invader. Outside of the dive bombing role, the plane also scored aerial victories, where a total of 84 enemy aircraft shot down, and the creation of a single ace, Lieutenant Michael T. Rousseau. Meanwhile, as time went on, the intensity of operations increased during 1943, and this led to the undermining of the A-36A's success, especially by June 1944, at which point the plane was being replaced in Europe with P-40s and P-47s. The plane was to also cease service with the United States' 311th Fighter Bomber Group, or FBG, in the China-Burma-India theatre from late 1943 to 1944, albeit the results the plane achieved in this theatre were less spectacular, as it was outclassed in most cases by Japan's Ki-43 fighter. And with our historical overview concluded, let us take a look at how the A-36 handles in War Thunder's arcade mode. Today's gameplay is brought to you from the ground strike map Paradise Island. For this we'll be using the following setup. Stealth belts for our machine guns, logic being that in my experience I've found these belts to be the most effective on this aircraft, where the combination of a singular armour piercing round, ideal for pilot sniping, by killing the pilot behind their bulletproof glass, backed up by the combination of 2 armour-piercing incendiary rounds and 2 incendiary rounds, ideal for penetrating fuselages and fuel tanks and subsequently igniting them, means that no foe is out of your reach where firepower is concerned. For our gun convergence, we have a 600 metre gun convergence, the logic being that our style of play will be long distance boom and zoom, alternatively interception, so we never want to get embroiled in a close quarters battle, but we always want to hit our foes from afar. And if we do happen to get a little bit closer, we've always got the 2 nose-mounted machine guns which are not convergence reliant and we can rely on them. And as for our fuel load, we are taking our standard 30-minute fuel load to make it to the end of the game, unscathed on fuel capacity. Now you will also note that we decided to take some secondary armament in the form of 2 external 500-pound bombs. Logic being that a number of you requested me to review this aircraft as both an attacker and a fighter, and we're going to do that in a single gameplay to demonstrate how taking ordnance will not hold this aircraft back, although I still personally prefer to fly it without the bombs mounted for its full capabilities. Anywho, we begin by attacking the Junkers 88C6, igniting their right hand engine as they dive out of a head to head with our friendly Yak 1. We break off and head towards the enemy bombers, and due to our attacker spawn, this means that we have the instant ability to attack the enemy bombers as we spawned in at 3,000 meters altitude, if not higher. Now this is great because we can catch the bombers before they can get to altitudes in excess of 4,000 or 4,500 meters altitude. And as we attack this H6K, we must explain why that's important. We're going to kill this H6K for causing them to burn to death, our incendiary rounds proving very valuable. And the problem with the A-36 is that it has the same issue as we found with the P-51. The Allison engine loses its performance in medium to high altitude regions, i.e. in the case of the A-36 at 4,000 meters altitude plus. There is a massive drop off in performance in this aircraft's engine, holding this plane back and leaving it very vulnerable to the medium to high altitude fighters you start to see around your battle rating, such as the Messerschmitt Y9E3 and the F1, and on top of that the Spitfires such as the Spitfire Mark IIA, which have the better performance up at those altitudes. Or we could go further and pick a very key example, the KI-44 Mark II. But regardless of that, so long as you can keep yourself below 4,000 meters altitude, your engine will perform at its maximum, and ideally you never want to go above 3,000 meters altitude once the bomber threat has been dispatched as far as possible. Because below 3,000 meters altitude, your engine purrs along like a dream, and we're going to see that for the rest of the game. As we dive down on a Hurricane Mark I late here, unfortunately not getting a clean angle and experiencing our control surface lockup, whereby we were diving on them at approximately 730 km an hour. But we'll come back to that later on, i.e. the lockup thresholds. For now, let us just talk about the energy retention of the A-36, and note here how despite our rather sharp dive and then sharp come out of the dive, carrying through to the A-20 Havoc, but unfortunately not getting the chance to take them down, we note our energy conservation has been rather good. And that is because this plane seems to retain energy very well so long as you do not make extremely exaggerated manoeuvres on the elevator. So very sharp turns after coming out of a dive, alternatively very sharp pull-ups of the stick, i.e. trying to go into a loop for example, will cause you to bleed excessive amounts of energy. But if you can keep things simple, gradual banking turns, or just levelling out, you'll retain a good amount of energy, and that means you can very quickly move across the battlefield after coming out of a dive and have nobody able to keep on your 6. And we're seeing that right here as we now catch this F1M2 by surprise, taking them out for our second kill before they can make it to our friendly base. And now we snap round, making a rather sharp turn, and we can see that cost us a bit of speed, going down from 500 km an hour to 450 km an hour, and now we're going to go into the ground attack role for a short while. Our intention is to take out as many medium tanks and pillboxes down this side of the map before moving back into the centre. But what's nice about the A-36 is because of its engine performance down low, making repeated ground strikes is not a problem. And because you are an attacker in game, that means that you do have the rather fast bomb reload, i.e. here it's at 41 seconds due to our crew build. We take out one tank and we're going to rinse and repeat our loops over the target, and taking out some anti-aircraft batteries as well, and some howitzers. And whilst we're doing that, let's start talking about the performance characteristics of the A-36 outside of the bomber role. Control surfaces. So some of you may be thinking right now, well, what's the turn circle like? Can I turn fight in this aircraft? Well, in my personal opinion, it's not an ideal turn fighter, even at higher speeds. And that is because the turn circle of this aircraft is roughly equivalent to that of a P400, meaning you've actually got one of the weaker turn circles at your battle rating and tier, falling far short of the likes of the Spitfire Mark IIA, and indeed the Yakovlev Yak 1. Now if you bring your other control surfaces into play, such as your rudder, you will find that this plane can turn quite quickly, or it can snap into a split from level flight very quickly and come around on its rudder, and that can catch people by surprise. And that is because the control surfaces when brought together are very powerful, but as individuals they're not so great. Your roll rate is your strongest control surface, or your ailerons we should really say, whereby you do have a high roll rate. And this means you can change direction on the fly, i.e. changing the orientation of your aircraft to change direction, as we come around here to attack the medium tanks once again. and your roll rate will stay with you up to a speed of 750 kilometers an hour, at which point there is a quick lockup to 800 kilometers an hour, whereby you will retain 75% of your overall roll rate. So that's not really a problem. As for the other control surfaces, the thresholds are not as kind perhaps, whereby in both the rudder and the elevator's cases you will retain only 50% of the controllability. Now the rudder is the weakest of the three control surfaces by itself, whereby it's okay, although making rudder turns, those flat horizontal turns, will take an extended period of time. So therefore you do not ideally want to use your rudder in isolation unless you are making a quick hammerhead as we see here. It's ideal for hammerheads but not for flat turns, and the rudder seems to work better in the vertical rather than the horizontal. And with regards to the lockup threshold, you'll find that between 700 and 800 kilometers an hour you will get that 50% lockup. As for your elevator, which is in the middle ground of your control surfaces, it's a rather heavy control surface but a responsive one nonetheless. You'll find that between 500 and 600 kilometers an hour you will lose 50% of its controllability. At which point, once you hit 600 kilometers an hour plus, the control surface really does start to feel heavy, and pulling up can take some time, with or without bombs. Talking about high speeds then, what about the maximum dive speed of this aircraft? Well, it's 931 kilometers an hour, and the dive speed acceleration is acceptable. This plane does take some time to build up its speed, especially once it hits the 600 km an hour mark. At which point this plane accelerates well at first in the dive, but then as soon as it hits 600 km an hour, the acceleration really does slow down. It's not as consistent as what you may expect, as we pick up our third kill going head to head with an A5M4. And we can see there how our nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns made the difference, as the target was way too close for us to be able to use our wing-mounted machine guns effectively. And now we loop over in order to take on the I-153, attacking them from above, as they seem so set on taking out ground targets, cleaning them off for our fourth kill. So what about acceleration in general then? Well, with your stall speed being set at 155 km an hour, which is rather high for your battle rating tier and something to be wary of, and something that can catch you off guard against the likes of say an A6M2N or the Spitfires or the Hurricanes that you'll encounter, your acceleration from your stall speed to 350 km an hour is acceptable. It's not that fast however. What's more interesting is the fact that your acceleration becomes phenomenal if you engage your war emergency power, at which point you will find you'll accelerate from your stall to 475 km an hour with war emergency power very rapidly, and then there is a sharp drop off of acceleration. So this plane seems to really enjoy you turning it up to the maximum and using your WEP to full potential. And speaking of full potential, we catch this Messerschmitt 109 ML3 off guard and take out their pilot for our ace. Now we can see how, having switched from the ground attack role, albeit taking out one more medium tank hopefully, we can very quickly cross back over into the middle of the battlefield and go plane hunting now. We're not held back by being in one role or the other, as we swoop in on the Blenheim here, who seems to be surviving despite the fires, and we finish them off for our sixth kill. Some could argue it's a kill steal, but it looked as though they were persistent on taking down one of our allies, so we made sure they were out of the game. And as we make our way away from the centre, noticing how we're holding good speed, we should also note that the ideal speed range for this aircraft when going into an engagement is between 350 to 550 km an hour. We did say that there is a lockup at 500 km an hour plus for your elevator, but because you're only halfway into the range if you start at 550 km an hour, you're not going to feel the maximal lockup at that point, which means starting an engagement at 550 km an hour is going to be a pleasure, not a problem. And so long as you can keep your speed above 350 km an hour, you're not going to start to feel sluggish in the air. Your control surface will be at their maximum responsibility, and therefore you can just enjoy this aircraft for what it is. And you can flit across the battlefield and get caught up in engagements if you so desire. But playing more of the hit and run type as we're seeing here is more practical. Now, one other question that some of you may be asking, what happens when I mount the bombs on this aircraft? I take the maximum bomb load, how does the plane's performance get affected? Well, its stall speed is going to increase because you've got the additional mass, and therefore low speed handling becomes a lot heavier and more difficult to do, especially from 275 km an hour downwards. Whereby your stall speed is still effectively 155 km an hour, but you'll start to feel your stall characteristics as far out as 200 km an hour. And therefore you can say that your stall has headed up in terms of speed. But in general you still retain the majority of your characteristics, One other area impacted is your climb rate, where it is reduced, but your climb rate is not exceptional to begin with. You have a climb rate which is roughly the same as the likes of a Yak 1, especially in the lower altitude regions, but it's going to be nowhere comparable to the likes of, say, a Messerschmitt 19 F1, a Ki-44, a Spitfire Mark 1, etc. as we take down the Corsair there for our 8th and final kill of the game. So therefore you can see how this plane is really optimised to low altitudes from the discussion we're having, and how we're playing it, just constantly switching back and forth across the battlefield. And at most points during this game we haven't even exceeded 1,500 metres altitude, let alone our 3,000 metre altitude limit that we discussed early on. And as the game comes to its end, it's time for us to take a look at the post-game stats. With our 8 kills and 11 ground targets destroyed, we picked up 29,077 Silver Lions and 6,395 research points. To defeat the A-36 in a given matchup then, I can recommend one of 3 approaches. The first approach is an intrinsic one, as there are a large number of aircraft at its battle rating and tier which have the superior turn circle, and that is to turn fight with it. Planes such as the Spitfire Mark IIA, the Messerschmitt 19 F1, the Ki-44 Mark II, and others all come to mind. And if you do not have the superior turn circle manoeuvrability, the second approach I can recommend is to engage this aircraft up at 4,000 metres altitude and higher. Logic being that the overall engine performance of this plane will fall to pieces at these altitudes, and therefore you'll gain the upper hand. And planes such as the B-34 Lexington, for example, can all outperform the A-36 at these altitudes, so that's more of a heavy fighter / bomber quandary. The third and final approach for those planes which lack the high altitude performance and lack the manoeuvrability, such as the P400 for example, is to go head to head with an A-36, as at the end of the day it only has 2 12.7mm machine guns in the nose, whereas these planes that we're talking about here will typically have 20mm cannon in the nose or wings, meaning that you'll have the firepower advantage in the head-on. And one last thing to note about the A-36 is that it is prone to receiving large amounts of engine damage, regardless of whether it's in a head-on or when pursuing an enemy bomber, or just in a simple grazing pass. The engine of this plane is exposed to the point whereby it can burst into flames if it takes multiple hits, something I have found on a number of occasions. Therefore you need to be careful in managing your durability in the A-36, as whilst the airframe itself can take a number of hits, the engine cannot. But by avoiding such circumstances today and flitting around the battlefield in our own A-36, we have demonstrated how this plane, despite being classed as an attacker both in game and in history, can mix up the roles of attacker and fighter very nicely, and even extend it into the interceptor role at the start of a given match, especially with that attacker spawn. And therefore, with its ability to constantly switch places on the battlefield, make incursions into enemy territory and then pull back into friendly lines, this plane in War Thunder really does live up to its real life nickname of the Invader. And so I've been TX141, and if you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies.